So the neglecting parent doesn't respond at all to the child. And to understand how this impacts their development, we can look to studies that focus on children who were brought up in orphanages and other similar state institutions that just didn't have the resources to provide that kind of nurture. So while they did see to the child's basic needs for food and shelter and hygiene, no one ever really interacted with the child, picked them up when they were crying and soothed them, talked to them, played with them, sang them to sleep, that kind of thing. And what they find is that these children grow up with severe emotional, relational, and social deficits that cannot be remedied later in life. Now, the abusive parent is chronically traumatizing the child, causing severe pain and terror. And we all know that when we are in danger, the fight or flight response kicks in. But what many people don't know is that when we cannot complete fight or flight, that is, when we can't escape or we can't defend ourselves, then the freeze response kicks in, which is also an instinct that switches off sensation and feeling so that the child doesn't have to suffer. And you see this also in nature with animals and other creatures. The impala that's now been captured by the lioness and realizes that it can't escape also goes into this kind of freeze response. So what happens to the child, what people describe it as they are outside themselves, or the abuse is happening to someone else. And they call this depersonalization, where conscious awareness is kind of abstracted out of the body. And others describe it as if the abuse is not really happening to them. And they call this one derealization. But there's this numbing of sensation and feeling. The intensity, frequency, and duration of the abuse determines the extent to which this dissociative response becomes a pattern and the extent to which the personality is fragmented, because dissociation generates separate memory systems, or rather it disrupts the integration between memory systems, generating these modes of operation that are usually quite imperceptible to most people, because the child or person slips so easily between them. But in time, these can become quite distinct, reticulated and articulated self-states or sub-personalities or quasi-identities. Like you have the danger mode or state, which has access to only danger and traumatic memories. Then you have the emotional and relational part of the personality, which got stuck and stunted at the age when the trauma, when the abuse began. And then you have the thinking, conscious part of the personality that had to grow up really quickly and develop defense and coping mechanisms and strategies in order to survive life with an abusive parent. And this part of the personality doesn't want to have anything to do with the memory of the trauma and the abuse, so they push it aside. They use distractions and entertainments to not have to revisit it. And even if they do get pulled into that, dissociation kicks in again and they cannot feel it. And then you also have what we can call the demonic state or mode, which is the raw pain and terror trapped and frozen in the body, in the musculature, in the visceral system. So this affects the actual structure of the brain. We all know that when the fight or flight response is activated, then thinking is temporarily suspended so that we can make a quick instinctive escape or defend ourselves. But in the case of chronic abuse and dissociation, not only is the child now in a hyper-aroused panic state and the feeling function is partially numbed out, but also this connection between the emotional limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, the thinking evaluating function, is severed, or rather it doesn't develop as it should. And so the child loses the capacity to evaluate the situation, to regulate their emotion, to calm themselves down, to assess their options, and to respond appropriately. The disorganized state is not a true attachment style, as Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main have observed and discussed, because eventually the child does settle back into a more or less avoidant or resistant or secure attachment style. But it is a glimpse into what's actually happening inside this child in response to a very minor stressor of mother leaving the room. And it's really scary.